Prepare to immerse yourself in a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Comment from where you're watching as we explore one of the most disturbing mysteries the Appalachian Mountains have ever witnessed. This is the story of Clara Belle Hensley, a woman whose life ended shrouded in secrets that echo through the Virginia mountains to this day. It was the year 1889. The Appalachian Mountains stretched like a natural barrier between the developed coast and the interior lands, creating isolated communities where news took weeks to reach and customs remained unchanged for generations. In Virginia, specifically in Greenbrier County, small settlements were scattered among deep valleys and hillsides covered in dense forests of oak and pine. Winter arrived early in the region, bringing thick fogs that turned trails into treacherous paths and further isolated those families who depended on subsistence farming and hunting for their livelihoods. Life in the Appalachians was harsh and unforgiving. Women worked from dawn to dusk, tending crops, animals, and homes without any modern comforts. Men went hunting or worked in the coal mines that were beginning to dot the region, lured by the promise of money that rarely materialized. Roads were poor when they existed, and justice depended on sheriffs who had to ride for days to respond to calls in the most remote areas. In this setting of isolation and rigid traditions, any unusual event took on enormous proportions, fueling whispers that passed from mouth to mouth for years. Clara Belle Hensley was 26 years old when her dark story began to unfold. She lived on a modest property near the community of Livesey Mill, a town so small it barely appeared on maps of the time. Clara was known for her striking beauty and a temperament many considered too strong for a woman of that era. She had dark hair tied back in a tight bun, eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances, and an erect posture that defied the expectations of feminine submission so common in those days. Her husband, Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, was a blacksmith who had arrived in the region just 2 years earlier, from the Virginia lowlands with promises of work and a reputation few truly knew. The marriage between Clara and Erasmus had happened in a rush, just a few months after they met at a local market. Some neighbors commented that Clara seemed different after the wedding, quieter, less likely to participate in the social gatherings held at the local church. Others noted that Erasmus had temper tantrums when contradicted, though he always appeared charming and polite in public. The couple's property was in a relatively isolated location, about 2 miles from the nearest house, connected only by a narrow trail that wound through the trees and crossed a small stream that froze in the colder months. In late January of that fateful year, snow covered the mountains with a white blanket that reflected the pale light of the winter sun. The cold was piercing, the kind that penetrated the bones and drove even animals to seek shelter. It was on a particularly frigid morning, January 23, 1889, that a local boy was sent to the Shue estate to ask Erasmus to make some repairs to farm tools. The young man knocked on the door several times without receiving an answer. Worried, he peeked out the window and saw something that sent him running back down the icy path, stumbling in the snow, his heart pounding and his face pale with terror. Clara Belle Hensley had been found sprawled on the living room floor at the foot of the stairs leading to the upper floor of the house. Her position was strange, unnatural, as if carefully arranged. Her hands were crossed over her chest, her feet together, and around her neck was tied an elaborate, almost decorative red scarf. When the local sheriff, John Preston, finally arrived hours later, riding more than 10 miles from the county seat, he found Erasmus sitting beside his wife's body, holding her hand and weeping profusely. The blacksmith explained through sobs that he had left early to work in his forge and, upon returning for lunch, discovered Clara in that condition. According to him, she must have tripped while descending the stairs, breaking her neck in the fall. The local physician, George Washington Knapp, was called to examine the body and issue a death certificate. Dr. Knapp was a middle-aged man who served a vast region of the Appalachians, often traveling on horseback over dangerous trails to attend to births, illnesses, and accidents. By the time he arrived at the Shue estate, it was already dusk. The house was lit only by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Erasmus had moved Clara's body to the upstairs bedroom and dressed her in her finest attire, a dark, high-necked gown that completely covered her neck. The widower insisted on remaining by his wife's side throughout the examination, constantly adjusting her clothing and almost obsessively placing pillows under her head. Dr. Knapp found the behavior strange, but respected his husband's grief. His examination was superficial, limited by the dim lighting. Erasmus's disturbing presence and the customs of the time that discouraged thorough examinations of women's bodies. He noticed some marks on Clara's neck, visible despite the scarf and high collar of her dress, but Erasmus quickly explained that they were the result of the fall. The doctor felt unusual stiffness in the cervical region, but again accepted the explanation of a fracture caused by a domestic accident. With no apparent reason to suspect anything more sinister, and pressured by the inconsolable blacksmith, who would not allow a more detailed examination, Dr. Knapp filled out the death certificate, indicating natural causes related to a fatal accident on the stairs. The funeral was scheduled for 2 days later, enough time for the news to spread through neighboring communities and for some relatives to make the long trip to Livesey Mill. The ceremony was to take place at the local Methodist church, a simple wooden building with hard pews and narrow windows that let in only thin beams of light. But something would happen during the wake that would completely change the course of this story, something that would transform a supposed domestic accident into one of the most intriguing and disturbing cases the Appalachian Mountains have ever seen. Clara Belle Hensley's wake began the next morning, as the first rays of sunlight timidly penetrated the mist shrouding the mountains. The Livesey Mill Methodist Church quickly filled with neighbors, acquaintances, and curious onlookers who had walked miles along the icy trails to pay their last respects. The coffin was positioned at the front of the church, open as was the custom of the time, allowing everyone to see Clara one last time before her burial in the small cemetery behind the building. But what was supposed to be an ordinary farewell turned into a disturbing spectacle that left everyone deeply uncomfortable. Erasmus Shue arrived dressed in all-black attire, with a dark tie and leather gloves that he never removed for a moment. His demeanor during the wake caught the attention of all present. He didn't allow anyone to get too close to the casket, positioning himself like a watchful guardian beside his wife's body. When anyone tried to lean in to get a closer look at Clara or touch her hand in a gesture of farewell, Erasmus intervened immediately, blocking access with his own body and explaining almost aggressively that his beloved wife deserved peace and should not be disturbed. Those who managed to catch a glimpse noticed that Clara's neck was wrapped in a thick cloth scarf and that her head rested on a high pillow that kept her chin elevated at an unnatural angle. Most disturbing, however, was the way Erasmus held Clara's head. Throughout the ceremony, he kept one hand resting on the side of her face as if caressing her cheek, but with a pressure that seemed closer to holding than caressing. When the local pastor tried to pray beside the coffin, briefly placing his hand on Clara's forehead in a gesture of blessing, Erasmus jerked the priest away, claiming that only he had the right to touch his wife. The atmosphere in the church became tense and uncomfortable. Women whispered among themselves, men exchanged meaningful glances, and everyone began to sense that something was deeply wrong. Among those present was Mary Jane Robinson, Clara Belle Hensley's mother. Mary Jane had traveled more than 20 miles from her home in another county upon receiving the devastating news of her daughter's death. She was a 52-year-old woman, hardened by hard work in the mountains, but with piercing eyes that missed no detail. From the moment she entered the church and saw Erasmus standing beside the casket, Mary Jane felt a chill run down her spine. She knew her daughter well, knew of her strong and independent spirit, and had never fully approved of her hasty marriage to the blacksmith who had appeared out of nowhere with sweet words and empty promises. Now, observing her son-in-law's bizarre behavior during the wake, her suspicions began to take shape. Mary Jane tried to approach the coffin to see her daughter one last time, but Erasmus blocked her path with a firmness that bordered on hostility. When she insisted, claiming her right as a mother to say a proper goodbye, the blacksmith only allowed her to stand a certain distance away, always under his watchful eye. Mary Jane immediately noticed the same things that had caught the attention of the others present: the thick scarf around her neck, the pillow too high, the rigid position of her head, and especially the dark marks that were visible even through all the fabric covering Clara's neck. Marks that didn't look like the result of an accidental fall down the stairs. Marks that suggested something far more sinister. After the burial, when everyone had returned home and the church was empty, Mary Jane remained in the cemetery for hours, kneeling before her daughter's fresh grave. Tears streamed down her face, weathered by the sun and Appalachian wind. But they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of anger, of helplessness, of a growing certainty that Clara hadn't died in a domestic accident. Mary Jane knew the stories about Erasmus, whispered rumors she'd ignored when her daughter decided to marry, stories of a violent temper, of a mysterious first marriage that ended abruptly, of a tarnished reputation in the lands he'd come from. Now, all those whispers took on a terrible weight. That night, back at her modest mountain home, Mary Jane Robinson made a decision that would change the course of this entire story. She would not accept the official version of events. She would not allow her daughter's death to be dismissed as just another accident common in the dangerous homes of Appalachia. Even if it meant confronting authorities, defying the customs of the time that discouraged women from questioning official decisions or investigating on her own in a land where justice was slow and often ineffective. Mary Jane would discover the truth about what really happened to Clara Belle Hensley on that frigid January morning. The following days were spent discreetly investigating. Mary Jane began visiting neighbors, asking careful questions about the relationship between Clara and Erasmus. What she discovered was disturbing. Several people reported hearing heated arguments coming from the couple's property, especially at night. One neighbor mentioned that Clara had once appeared with a visible bruise on her arm, unconvincingly explaining that she had tripped while carrying firewood. Another local resident said that Erasmus had a habit of drinking excessive amounts of homemade liquor and that his behavior changed dramatically when intoxicated, becoming aggressive and irrational. All these stories were shared in hushed tones, with evident fear of reprisal. Mary Jane also uncovered details about Erasmus's past that no one in the community fully knew. The blacksmith had previously been married to a woman named Allie Esteline Cutlip, who had died under unclear circumstances just a year before he met Clara. Some records indicated that Allie's death was recorded as a result of health complications, but no one could provide specific details. Prior to this, Erasmus had been imprisoned for a few months for horse theft, a serious crime in rural Virginia at the time. His arrival at Livesey Mill had been an attempt to start over in a place where his past would be obscured, where he could build a new reputation and leave behind the mistakes that haunted him. Armed with all this disturbing information, Mary Jane Robinson sought out Greenbrier County District Attorney John Alfred Preston, who also served as the region's top prosecutor. Preston was a respected man, known for his integrity and his unyielding attitude toward local power. When Mary Jane entered his office on a cold February afternoon, about 2 weeks after Clara's death, she carried with her not only her suspicions, but also a steely determination that impressed the prosecutor. For more than 3 hours, she presented every detail she had uncovered, every inconsistency in the official story, every bizarre behavior by Erasmus during the wake. Preston listened intently, taking notes in a worn leather notebook. He was well aware of the difficulties of investigating crimes in Appalachia, where geographic isolation and distrust of authorities often prevented the truth from being uncovered. But something in Mary Jane's words, the way she described her son-in-law's behavior, and the marks she'd seen on her daughter's neck, aroused the same suspicion in him. Preston knew that reopening a case that had already been officially closed would be controversial, especially when the death certificate had been signed by a respected doctor in the community. But he also knew his responsibility was to seek justice, no matter the hardships or social pressure he would face. After consulting with physician George Washington Knapp and reviewing his notes from the preliminary examination of Clara's body, Preston made an extraordinary decision for that time and place. He would order the exhumation of Clara Belle Hensley's body so that a more detailed post-mortem examination could be performed. The news spread through Appalachian communities like wildfire, sparking heated debate. Some supported the decision, especially those who had witnessed Erasmus's strange behavior during the wake. Others considered the measure sacrilege, a violation of the eternal rest that every person deserved. Erasmus Shue, when informed of the decision, exploded in fury, threatening to sue the prosecutor and anyone involved in what he called the unjust persecution of a grieving widower. The exhumation was scheduled for February 22, 1889, exactly 1 month after Clara Belle Hensley's death. The Livesey Mill Methodist Cemetery woke that morning covered in a thin layer of ice that reflected the pale light of dawn. City Councillor John Alfred Preston had arranged everything discreetly, but it was impossible to keep an event of this magnitude a secret in such a small community. Curious onlookers began gathering around the cemetery even before sunrise, forming small groups that chatted in hushed tones as they watched the preparations with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. 3 doctors were summoned to perform the examination. Dr. George Washington Knapp, who had performed the initial analysis, and 2 other professionals from neighboring counties brought in specifically to ensure impartiality. Dr. Lorenzo Dow McMillan rode over 40 miles from Lewisburg, riding over 25 miles through the icy mountains, while Dr. Samuel Leonard Rucker arrived from Pocahontas County, where he maintained a modest but respected medical practice. The presence of 3 doctors at an autopsy was extraordinary for that region and time, demonstrating the seriousness with which the prosecutor took the case. Clara's coffin was removed from the frozen earth with difficulty. Local men worked for hours with shovels and pickaxes, breaking up the soil hardened by the harsh Appalachian winter. When they finally managed to lift the coffin and open it, all present fell silent. Clara's body was remarkably well preserved, given the freezing temperatures that had gripped the region since her burial. She still wore the dark, high-collared gown Erasmus had dressed her in, and the red scarf remained tied around her neck as an eerie reminder of that fateful January morning. The doctors requested that a makeshift area be prepared in a small shed near the cemetery, away from prying eyes. The body was carefully transported and placed on a rough wooden table. Prosecutor Preston was present, accompanied by Sheriff John Preston and a clerk who would document each discovery. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew that what would be discovered in that cold shed could completely change the official narrative of Clara's death and potentially send a man to the gallows. Dr. McMillan, who had more experience in forensic medicine, having worked briefly in Richmond before moving to the countryside, led the examination. With precise and professional movements, he began by removing the red scarf and high-necked dress that had hidden Clara's neck during the wake. What was revealed sent a chill through even the most hardened men in the room. Clara's neck bore deep, extensive marks that could not possibly have been the result of an accidental fall. There were dark bruises on either side of her windpipe, patterns suggesting intense and prolonged pressure. The nape of her neck also showed signs of severe trauma. Dr. McMillan proceeded with a careful dissection of the neck tissues. What he found confirmed Mary Jane Robinson's and Prosecutor Preston's worst suspicions. The cricoid cartilage was completely crushed. The first and second cervical vertebrae were dislocated in a way that would be impossible in a common fall down a flight of stairs. There was massive internal bleeding in the neck muscles, indicating that Clara had struggled against a tremendous external force. The 3 doctors unanimously agreed. These injuries were consistent with manual strangulation, followed by a violent twist that broke the victim's neck. Clara Belle Hensley had not died in an accident. She had been murdered. The medical report was written in meticulous detail. Each injury was documented, measured and described in technical terms that left no room for alternative interpretation. A visibly shaken doctor. Knapp admitted that his initial examination had been inadequate and that the circumstances during the wake, with Erasmus constantly interfering and positioning the body to obscure the injuries, had prevented a proper analysis. He accepted responsibility for the error, but also made it clear that the widower's behavior that day had been deliberately obstructive, designed to prevent the truth from coming out. With the medical report in hand, District Attorney Preston had no more doubts. He issued an arrest warrant for Erasmus Stribling Troutshoe for first-degree murder. The formal charge alleged that the blacksmith had premeditatedly and with extreme violence taken the life of his wife, Clara Belle Hensley, on the morning of January 23, 1889. Sheriff Preston assembled a small group of deputies and rode to the Shoe property to make the arrest. They expected resistance, perhaps even violence, but instead found Erasmus sitting at his cold forge, staring into space as if he had known this moment would inevitably arrive. The arrest was carried out without incident. Erasmus was handcuffed and placed on a horse for the long ride to the county jail in Lewisburg. Throughout the journey, he didn't say a word, maintaining a blank expression that disturbed even the most experienced men escorting him. By the time they reached the jail, a solid stone building that served as the seat of local justice, a small crowd had already gathered. News of the arrest had spread quickly, and many wanted to see for themselves the man accused of killing his wife with his own hands. The cell where Erasmus was placed was small and damp, with only a narrow window allowing light to enter. In the following days, he would receive visits from the prosecutor and his defense attorney, but he would remain almost completely silent, offering only monosyllabic answers when questioned. This drastic change in behavior, from a man who had previously wept profusely during the wake to someone completely apathetic and disconnected, further fueled suspicions about his guilt. It was as if, once exposed, he had given up on maintaining the charade he had so carefully constructed. While Erasmus remained incarcerated, Prosecutor Preston began building his case with the meticulousness of a craftsman. He interviewed dozens of people who knew the couple, gathering testimonies about their turbulent relationship, the episodes of domestic violence Clara had tried to hide, and Erasmus's explosive temper when contradicted. Every small detail mattered, every shared memory adding another layer to the narrative of a marriage marked by control, fear, and, ultimately, tragedy. One of the most important witnesses was Martha Jane Heaster, Clara's sister, who had visited the couple a few weeks before their deaths. Martha recounted a disturbing conversation she had had with her sister during that visit. Clara had confided, tearfully, that her marriage had been a terrible mistake. She described how Erasmus became a completely different person when he was alone with her, how he blamed her for everything that went wrong in his life, how he talked obsessively about his previous marriage and constantly compared Clara to his first wife. Martha also mentioned that Clara had expressed fear, saying that she sometimes felt Erasmus looking at her in a way that made her question her own safety. Another crucial testimony came from Jacob Wilson, a rival blacksmith working in a neighboring community. Jacob revealed that Erasmus had sought employment with him a few months after his marriage to Clara, casually mentioning during their conversation that his first wife had conveniently died when he was facing financial difficulties, allowing him to receive a small inheritance that temporarily solved his problems. Erasmus's description of Ali's death, with an almost indifferent and matter-of-fact tone, had deeply disturbed Jacob, who now regretted not reporting his suspicions to the authorities at the time. The prosecutor also delved deeper into Erasmus's past before his arrival in Appalachia. Documents obtained from other counties revealed a troubling pattern. In addition to the horse theft offense for which he had been arrested, there were records of complaints filed against him by various women over the years. One woman in Richmond had obtained a restraining order, alleging that Erasmus obsessively stalked her after she rejected his romantic advances. Another had reported physical assault during a brief relationship that ended when she managed to escape in the middle of the night. All of this information painted the picture of a man with a history of violence against women, someone unable to accept rejection or control his destructive impulses. As the case against Erasmus Shue strengthened, the community of Livesey Mill and the surrounding area remained divided. Some defended the presumption of innocence, arguing that the evidence, while disturbing, was still circumstantial in some ways. Others, especially local women who had seen their own experiences of domestic violence reflected in Clara's story, called for immediate justice. The case had touched deep wounds in Appalachian society, where violence against women was often tolerated or ignored, hidden behind closed doors, and protected by a code of silence that prioritized family reputation over individual safety. The trial of Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue was scheduled for early June 1889, about 5 months after the death of Clara Belle Hensley. The date was not chosen randomly. Prosecutor Preston wanted enough time to ensure that every detail of the case was thoroughly documented, every witness properly prepared, and every piece of evidence organized irrefutably. He knew he was facing not only a defendant, but also centuries of social prejudices that minimized domestic violence and made it difficult to secure convictions in cases where husbands killed their wives. The build-up to the trial galvanized the entire region. Lewisburg, the seat of Greenbrier County, became an unusual center of attention. Journalists from larger Virginia cities began arriving, staying in the few available boarding houses, and filling local taverns with their lively conversations about the case that was capturing everyone's imagination. The local newspaper, the Greenbrier Independent, devoted full pages to coverage of the events, reporting each new development and fueling the increasingly heated public debate. It was rare for Appalachia to see so much outside attention, and many locals were unsure whether to feel pride or discomfort at the sudden scrutiny. Erasmus's defense was handled by attorney James Preston Howard, a seasoned attorney known for his rhetorical skill and for taking on difficult cases. Howard knew he was facing an uphill battle. The medical evidence was devastating. His client's behavior during the wake had been inexplicably suspicious, and the violent past the prosecutor had unearthed painted a grim picture. Still, Howard was a competent attorney who believed in the presumption of innocence and the right of every accused to a vigorous defense. His strategy would be to question the reliability of the evidence, suggest alternative explanations for the injuries, and attempt to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. During the months leading up to the trial, Howard visited Erasmus regularly in jail, trying to extract information that might be useful to the defense. But the blacksmith remained in his state of near catatonic apathy, offering little more than brief and often contradictory answers. On some visits, Erasmus vehemently insisted on his innocence, claiming that Clara had indeed fallen down the stairs, and that all the charges against him were the result of a conspiracy orchestrated by his vengeful mother-in-law. On other occasions, he remained completely silent, staring blankly at the stone walls of the cell as if in another world. This erratic behavior worried Howard, who feared that his client might have a mental breakdown during the trial. Mary Jane Robinson, meanwhile, was restless. Clara's mother had become a constant presence in the district attorney's office, offering any assistance she could, and ensuring her daughter's memory was honored through her tireless pursuit of justice. She had become a familiar figure in Lewisburg, walking the streets with a straight posture and visible determination, always carrying a small photograph of Clara that she showed to anyone willing to listen. Mary Jane had transformed her grief into a crusade, not only for her daughter, but for all the women who suffered in silence under the tyranny of abusive husbands. When the trial day finally arrived, the Lewisburg courthouse was packed. The courtroom, located on the second floor of the stone building that served as the county's administrative headquarters, had a capacity of approximately 100 people, but easily twice as many tried to enter that June morning. The judge presiding over the case was the Honorable Ezekiel Alderson Thompson, a 63-year-old man known for his seriousness and impartiality. Thompson had presided over countless cases throughout his career, but even he recognized that this trial was different, fraught with implications that went far beyond the guilt or innocence of a single man. Jury selection took 2 full days. Prosecutor Preston wanted to ensure that the men chosen, as only men could serve as jurors at that time, would be able to consider the evidence objectively, without allowing prejudices about marital relationships to cloud their judgment. Howard, on the other hand, sought jurors who might be sympathetic to his narrative of a tragic accident, misinterpreted and turned into a murder charge by a resentful mother-in-law. In the end, 12 men were selected, mostly local farmers and merchants representing a typical cross-section of the Appalachian male population. The trial officially began on a warm June morning. The heat was already intense even with the windows open, and large paper fans were distributed among those present, trying to keep cool while waiting for the proceedings to begin. Erasmus Shue was brought in from the adjacent cell, now dressed in more presentable clothes provided by his lawyer. He appeared to have aged years during his months in prison, with a gaunt face and deep circles under his eyes that gave him an almost ghostly appearance. As he entered the courtroom, a murmur ran through the crowd, quickly silenced by Judge Thompson's gavel. Prosecutor Preston opened the case with an opening statement that lasted over an hour. In a firm, controlled voice, he outlined the narrative he would present, the story of a young, vibrant woman whose life was brutally cut short by a violent husband with a history of abuse. Preston described how Clara had tried to make her marriage work despite the danger signs, how she had hidden the bruises and humiliations, how she had hoped the man she had initially loved could become that person again. And then, with surgical precision, Preston explained how Erasmus had finally crossed the line, strangling his wife to death and then attempting to cover up his crime with an elaborate staging of a domestic accident. Preston's strategy was clear from the start. He would build his case layer by layer, starting with the couple's relationship, moving on to evidence of Erasmus's violent behavior, the suspicious circumstances of her death, and culminating in the devastating medical testimony that would prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Clara had been murdered. Each witness would be carefully selected to add another brick to the wall surrounding Erasmus, until the jury had no choice but to acknowledge the dark truth before them. The first witness called was Martha Jane Heaster, Clara's sister. Martha stepped onto the stand visibly nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. In a soft but firm voice, she recounted the conversations she had had with Clara in the weeks before her death, describing the fear her sister had expressed and the troubling changes she had noticed in her behavior. Martha spoke of how Clara, a normally cheerful and communicative woman, had become withdrawn and anxious after her marriage, how she would jump at the sound of footsteps or loud voices, and how her eyes always seemed to be searching for exits from any room she was in. During cross-examination, Howard attempted to discredit Martha's testimony, suggesting that she was retrospectively interpreting normal behaviors through the distorted lens of tragedy. He asked if Clara had ever explicitly stated that she feared for her life or if she had asked for help leaving the marriage. Martha admitted that Clara had never been so direct, but emphasized that the fear was palpable, even when unspoken. She described the look she had seen in her sister's eyes during her last visit, a look that now, knowing the terrible outcome, she recognized as that of someone trapped in a no-win situation. The next witness was Jacob Wilson, the rival blacksmith who had spoken with Erasmus months before Clara's death. Jacob was a large, strong man, with hands calloused from constant work in the forge, but his voice trembled with emotion as he recounted the disturbing conversation he had had with the accused. He recounted for the jury how Erasmus had casually mentioned the convenient death of his first wife, how he had spoken about inheritance with a detachment that seemed inappropriate, how he had displayed a lack of genuine emotion when discussing the loss of someone he had supposedly loved. Jacob confessed that the conversation had deeply disturbed him, but that at the time he had never imagined he might be listening to the disguised confessions of a murderer. Howard fiercely attacked this testimony, arguing that Jacob was interpreting a banal conversation in a completely distorted way, influenced by his later knowledge of the events. He suggested that Jacob, as Erasmus's business competitor, had questionable motivations for portraying his rival in a negative light, but Jacob stood firm, insisting that he was simply reporting what he had experienced and that his conscience would no longer allow him to remain silent. Witness after witness took the stand during the first days of the trial. Neighbors who had heard arguments coming from the shoe property, a local shopkeeper who had sold Clara medicinal ointments to treat bruises the young wife claimed were the result of frequent falls, a pastor who had tried to counsel the couple after hearing rumors of marital problems but was met with hostility by Erasmus and dismissed before he could offer any real help. Each testimony added depth to the narrative of a marriage marked by escalating violence and abusive control. On the fourth day of the trial, Prosecutor Preston presented the jury with a trove of documents he had obtained through correspondence with authorities in other Virginia counties. These records revealed Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe's dark past in far greater detail than any oral testimony could. There was the record of his arrest for horse theft in 1885, including notes from the sheriff at the time describing the prisoner's aggressive and defiant behavior. There were also transcripts of complaints filed by women in various locations, each describing episodes of intimidation, stalking, or physical violence. One of the most disturbing documents was a letter written by Allie Esteline Cutlip, Erasmus's first wife, to a cousin just a few months before his death. In this letter, discovered among the family's belongings after the Clara investigation began, Allie described her marriage as a prison. She wrote about how Erasmus controlled every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to the people she could talk to. Allie mentioned episodes of uncontrollable rage, where her husband would break furniture and shout unfounded accusations. Even more disturbing, she expressed genuine fear, writing that she would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to find Erasmus looking at her with an expression that made her wonder if she would ever see the morning. The reading of this letter in court provoked an immediate reaction. Women in the audience began to weep openly, identifying with the terror described in Allie's words. Men exchanged uncomfortable glances, some perhaps recognizing in themselves or in acquaintances similar behaviors they had always rationalized as normal. Erasmus, seated at the defense table, remained motionless throughout the reading, his face an expressionless mask that revealed neither remorse nor anger or nothing at all. Howard vehemently objected to the introduction of this letter into evidence, arguing that it was irrelevant to the current case and would only serve to prejudice his client through association with unrelated events. Judge Thompson considered the objection carefully, acknowledging that there was merit in the defense's concern that evidence could unfairly influence the jury. However, after deliberation, he decided to allow the letter, arguing that it established a pattern of behavior relevant to understanding the relationship between Erasmus and Clara. This was a significant victory for the prosecution, solidifying the narrative that the defendant had a systematic history of abusing women. Prosecutor Preston then called his most crucial witness, Dr. Lorenzo Dow McMillan, who had led the post-mortem examination following the exhumation of Clara's body. Dr. Macmillan was a distinguished-looking man with a well-groomed grey beard and reading glasses hanging on a silver chain around his neck. He brought with him detailed anatomical diagrams and his own meticulous notes from the examination, prepared to present medical evidence in a way that even laymen could understand the nature of Clara's injuries. For over 3 hours, Dr. Macmillan led the jury through every aspect of the examination. He explained in simple terms how the human neck works, the location of vital structures, and the type of force required to cause the specific injuries found on Clara. Using diagrams, he showed where the bruises were, how they formed a pattern consistent with fingers pressing against the trachea, and how the fractured cervical vertebrae indicated a violent twist that would be impossible in an accidental fall down a ladder. His voice was calm and professorial, but the information he conveyed was absolutely devastating to the defense. Dr. Macmillan also directly addressed the question everyone was wondering. Could Clara have fallen down the stairs and accidentally caused all those injuries? His answer was unequivocal. No. The injuries were multiple, in different locations, and followed patterns that could only be explained by deliberate action by another person. He explained that in accidental falls, even the most severe injuries tend to be unilateral and concentrated at points of impact. What Clara had was completely different. Bilateral neck trauma, crushing structures that required sustained pressure, and vertebral displacement that required specifically applied rotational force. Howard attempted to challenge the medical testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that the doctor was making assumptions based on interpretive evidence. He questioned whether Dr. Macmillan had sufficient experience with strangulation cases to make such categorical statements. The doctor responded with professional patience, explaining that although homicide cases were relatively rare in Appalachia, he had studied forensic medicine extensively during his training in Richmond and had consulted specialized medical texts before issuing his conclusions. He further emphasized that he was not alone in his conclusions, as the other 2 doctors present during the exhumation had independently reached the same conclusions. The defense attorney then tried another tack, suggesting that the injuries could have been caused or aggravated by the exhumation and examination process itself. Dr. Macmillan dismissed this possibility immediately, explaining that the bruises observed were old, clearly dating from the time of death, and that the vertebral fractures showed signs of having occurred when the tissue was still alive and circulating. He detailed how post-mortem hematomas look completely different from ante-mortem hematomas and how a trained physician can easily distinguish between the two. Each answer was delivered with a calm confidence that made it impossible to question his credibility. After the medical testimony, the prosecutor presented evidence related to Erasmus's behavior during the wake. Several people who had been present that day were called to describe how the widower had acted bizarrely and suspiciously. Rebecca Parsons, an elderly neighbor who had known Clara since she was a child, described with a trembling voice how Erasmus had physically prevented mourners from approaching the casket, how he held his hand on Clara's head in a way that seemed closer to holding than caressing, and how he had reacted with disproportionate aggression when the pastor attempted to offer appropriate blessings. Samuel Tucker, one of the men who had helped carry the coffin to the cemetery, testified about something he had observed but not fully understood at the time. He had noticed that when the coffin was moved, Clara's head had shifted slightly, briefly revealing the extent of the injuries to her neck. Erasmus had immediately repositioned his wife's head and adjusted the red scarf, but not before Samuel saw dark marks that were clearly not the result of a fall. At the time, he had rationalized what he had seen, unwilling to believe that something so terrible could have happened in his quiet community. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and the revelations of the post-mortem examination, he understood that he had witnessed a desperate attempt to conceal evidence of murder. The most emotionally charged testimony came from Mary Jane Robinson, Clara's mother. When she took the stand on the 6th day of the trial, the courtroom fell completely silent. Mary Jane had waited patiently for her opportunity to speak, and now, finally, she would have the chance to tell her daughter's story from the perspective of someone who had known her since birth. She began by describing Clara as a cheerful and lively child, always curious about the world around her, always kind to people and animals. She spoke of how Clara had grown to be a strong and independent woman, qualities Mary Jane had encouraged, even when society suggested women should be submissive and silent. Mary Jane then described how everything had changed after marrying Erasmus. She had immediately noticed that her daughter was different during the visits, which had become increasingly rare. Clara, who had always been communicative and open, had begun to measure every word, nervously glance at her husband before answering simple questions and making excuses to cut visits short. Mary Jane confessed that she had confronted Clara about her concerns, but that her daughter had downplayed them, insisting that she was simply adjusting to married life and that challenges were normal for any young couple. With tears streaming down her aging face, Mary Jane recounted the last conversation she had had with Clara just 2 weeks before her death. Clara had visited alone, a rare occurrence, as Erasmus usually insisted on accompanying her everywhere. During that visit, Clara had hugged her mother for a long time, longer than usual, and whispered words that now haunted Mary Jane every night. "If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident." Mary Jane had immediately asked what Clara meant, but her daughter had turned away, denied having said anything, and hurried away when they heard the sound of horses approaching, signaling Erasmus's return. Those prophetic words echoed through the courtroom, leaving many in attendance visibly shaken. Prosecutor Preston allowed the silence to linger for a few moments, letting the weight of that revelation sink in deeply. Then gently, he asked Mary Jane why she hadn't reported that conversation to the authorities immediately after Clara's death. Mary Jane responded with painful honesty, because she hadn't wanted to believe it, because believing it would have meant accepting that her daughter had lived in terror and that she, as a mother, had failed to protect her. Attorney Howard's cross-examination of Mary Jane Robinson was a delicate moment in the trial. Howard knew that attacking a grieving mother could easily backfire in the eyes of the jury, but his responsibility as a defense attorney required him to question the credibility and motivations behind her testimony. With calculated care, he began by suggesting that Mary Jane, in her state of deep grief, might be reinterpreting memories through the distorted lens of tragedy. He asked if it was possible that the final conversation with Clara had been misunderstood, that perhaps his daughter was speaking about general concerns related to life in the isolated mountains, where domestic accidents were tragically common. Mary Jane didn't waver. With a strength that impressed everyone in the room, she looked directly at Howard and declared that a mother knows her daughter better than anyone else in the world. She knew the tone of voice Clara had used, recognized the fear in her eyes, and no amount of questioning would change what she had witnessed that day. When Howard suggested that her testimony might be motivated by personal resentment against Erasmus, Mary Jane openly admitted that she had never fully approved of the marriage, but emphasized that her quest for justice was not about personal revenge. It was about ensuring that the truth prevailed, and that her daughter had not died in vain. After Mary Jane left the dais, visibly exhausted but with her dignity intact, Prosecutor Preston announced that he was nearing the end of his presentation of evidence. He had meticulously built a case that connected Erasmus's violent history, his abusive relationship with Clara, the suspicious circumstances of his death, his bizarre behavior during the wake, and the irrefutable medical evidence of homicide. All that remained was to present a few final witnesses who could definitively seal the defendant's fate. One such witness was the young man who had discovered Clara's body that freezing January morning. Now, months later, he still seemed deeply affected by what he had seen. In a hesitant voice, he described finding the shoe house's door ajar, unusual given the intense cold that day. He recounted how he had entered calling for Erasmus, how his eyes had adjusted to the dim interior, and how he had finally seen Clara lying on the floor. What had disturbed him most, besides the sight of the lifeless body, was the way Clara seemed to have been positioned. Her hands were crossed perfectly over her chest, her feet precisely aligned, and that bright red scarf around her neck seemed almost decorative. It was not the scene of a chaotic accident, but of something carefully arranged. The prosecutor also presented testimony from a cloth merchant who had sold Erasmus that particular red scarf just 3 days before Clara's death. The merchant remembered the transaction well because Erasmus had insisted on a particularly strong and durable fabric, unusually testing its durability before making the purchase. At the time, the merchant had thought it might have been a gift for his wife, but now, knowing the terrible use the scarf had been put to, the memory haunted him deeply. This detail suggested premeditation, indicating that Erasmus may have planned the murder days before carrying it out. When Preston finally announced that the prosecution had finished its presentation, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with the inevitability of what was to come. The defense now had its opportunity to present an alternative narrative, to attempt to create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. Howard stood with visible determination, aware that he faced a nearly impossible battle, but committed to giving his client the best possible defense within the ethical bounds of his profession. Howard's defense strategy was multifaceted. First, he would attempt to argue that the medical evidence, while superficially convincing, still allowed for alternative interpretations. He called as a witness a physician from a neighboring town, Dr. Henry Caldwell, who had agreed to review the post-mortem examination reports and offer a second opinion. Dr. Caldwell, an older man with decades of experience, suggested that while the injuries were certainly serious, it was not entirely impossible that a particularly violent fall down a ladder, perhaps with multiple impacts during the descent, could theoretically cause similar trauma. However, under rigorous questioning from Prosecutor Preston, Dr. Caldwell was forced to admit that he himself had never examined Clara's body, that his opinions were based solely on written reports, and that the probability of an accidental fall causing that particular pattern of injuries was extremely low, perhaps 1 in thousands. Preston also revealed that Dr. Caldwell had been paid handsomely by the defense for his testimony, a revelation that significantly tarnished his credibility in the eyes of the jury. The attempt to create doubt through contradictory medical evidence had failed spectacularly. Howard then shifted tactics, focusing on Erasmus's character and attempting to humanize him for the jury. He called neighbors who described the defendant as a diligent worker, someone who always paid his debts and fulfilled his professional obligations. A pastor from a congregation Erasmus had briefly attended after arriving in Appalachia testified that the blacksmith seemed genuinely interested in improving his life and pursuing a virtuous path. These witnesses painted a portrait of a flawed but not monstrous man, someone trying to rebuild his life after past mistakes. But Prosecutor Preston was prepared to dismantle these characterizations. During his cross-examinations, he skillfully extracted admissions that these character testimonies were based on superficial public interactions with Erasmus. None of these people truly knew the defendant intimately. None had been present during private moments between Erasmus and Clara. Their opinions were shaped by a carefully constructed persona Erasmus presented to the outside world, a mask that hid the violence occurring behind closed doors. The defense also attempted to suggest that Mary Jane Robinson had orchestrated a sort of witch hunt against Erasmus, motivated by personal animosity and the psychological need to blame someone for her daughter's tragic death. Howard argued that Mary Jane, unable to accept that random accidents happen, had convinced herself and eventually the authorities that a crime had occurred, when in reality it was merely a terrible but accidental tragedy. This line of argument, however, rang hollow against the overwhelming weight of the evidence the prosecutor had presented. On the 8th day of the trial, the moment many had anticipated with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension arrived. Erasmus Stribling Troutshoe would testify in his own defense. It was a risky decision. Lawyers generally discourage defendants from taking the stand, especially in murder cases, as cross-examination could be devastating. But Howard had concluded that without Erasmus himself directly denying the charges, there was no real hope of acquittal. Maybe, just maybe, if Erasmus could convince the jury of his innocence through his own words, there was still a chance. When Erasmus rose and walked to the dais, all eyes in the courtroom were fixed on him. He had been carefully dressed for the occasion, in simple but clean clothes that made him look more like an honest farmer than an accused murderer. After taking the oath to tell the truth, Erasmus sat and looked briefly at the jury before lowering his eyes. Howard began with basic questions, establishing how Erasmus had met Clara, how they had fallen in love, how he had genuinely believed he had finally found the companion who would make his life complete. Erasmus described his marriage to Clara as happy, though he admitted that, like any couple, they had occasional disagreements. He vehemently denied any suggestion of domestic violence, explaining that the bruises some witnesses mentioned were a result of the natural hardships of rural life in the mountains, where injuries were common due to constant physical labor. Regarding the day of Clara's death, Erasmus stuck to his original story. He had left early to work in his forge, returned for lunch, and discovered his wife dead on the floor near the stairs. He insisted that his behavior during the wake was the result of intense grief and a desire to protect his wife's dignity, not an attempt to hide evidence. Erasmus's direct examination by his own attorney lasted approximately 2 hours. Howard led his client through a carefully constructed narrative, attempting to explain each suspicious aspect of his behavior in a way that would generate sympathy or at least understanding from the jury. Erasmus spoke about his difficult past, admitting his past mistakes, but insisting that he had worked hard to redeem himself. He described his horse-stealing arrest as a youthful mistake made in a moment of financial desperation, something for which he had paid his debt to society, and that should not define him forever. When Howard asked about the death of his first wife, Allie, Erasmus responded with what appeared to be genuine emotion. He explained that Allie had been in poor health since they met, suffering from a respiratory condition that doctors at the time had failed to properly diagnose. Her death, according to Erasmus, had been natural and expected, though still devastating to him. He emphatically denied any suggestion that he had contributed to Allie's demise or that he had benefited significantly financially from her death. The inheritance mentioned by previous witnesses was modest, just enough to cover outstanding debts and allow for a fresh start elsewhere. Regarding the disturbing letter Allie had written to a cousin, Erasmus dismissed it as misunderstandings magnified by the imagination of a sick and isolated woman. He suggested that Allie, in her moments of physical weakness, had become prone to distorted interpretations of normal husband-wife interactions. He admitted to having a strong temper, but insisted he had never crossed the line into physical violence against any woman. His defense consisted of portraying himself as a flawed but fundamentally decent man, someone who had tried his best under difficult circumstances and who was now being wrongly accused of a horrific crime he never committed. But then came the moment everyone had been waiting for with trepidation: Prosecutor Preston's cross-examination. Preston had waited patiently throughout the defense's presentation, taking meticulous notes and preparing for this crucial moment. When Howard finally gave the testimony, Preston slowly stood up, adjusted his vest, and walked until he was just a few feet away from Erasmus. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of people shifting in their seats, trying not to miss a word of what was about to happen. Preston began almost conversationally, asking Erasmus to recount his routine that morning of January 23rd. Erasmus repeated his story. He had woken before dawn, made his own coffee, fed the animals, and then gone to his forge, located about 200 meters from the house. Preston listened intently, allowing Erasmus to speak without interruption. Then, with surgical precision, he began to identify inconsistencies and problematic points in the narrative. Preston asked why Erasmus hadn't brought Clara coffee before leaving, something that would be common for a devoted husband. Erasmus replied that he didn't want to wake her, as she had slept poorly the night before. Preston then asked how he knew she had slept poorly if he himself was sleeping. Erasmus hesitated, stumbled over his words, and finally said that Clara had mentioned not feeling well the night before. Preston pressed further. If Clara wasn't well, why had Erasmus left her alone for hours? Why hadn't he checked on her before leaving? Erasmus was beginning to sweat visibly, his answers becoming less and less coherent. The prosecutor then shifted focus, asking about the red scarf found around Clara's neck. Erasmus insisted it was a scarf Clara often wore, one of her favorite accessories. Preston produced the fabric merchant's testimony, showing that Erasmus had purchased that particular scarf just 3 days before Clara's death, and that during the purchase he had tested its unusual strength. Erasmus tried to explain that he was testing the quality because he wanted to give his wife something durable, but his explanation sounded weak and desperate. Preston then addressed the issue of the body's positioning. He asked Erasmus if he had moved or touched Clara after discovering her. Erasmus initially denied it, but then corrected himself, saying he had checked her pulse and perhaps adjusted her position slightly. Preston pressed. How exactly had he adjusted her? Erasmus described crossing her hands over her chest and perhaps straightening her feet. Preston asked why someone, upon discovering their wife apparently the victim of a fatal accident, would spend time arranging the body so carefully instead of immediately seeking help or attempting CPR. Erasmus had no satisfactory answer. The prosecutor continued methodically demolishing every aspect of Erasmus's story. He questioned why the defendant had so obsessively insisted on maintaining control over Clara's body during the wake, why he hadn't allowed even her own mother to properly approach. Erasmus claimed he was protecting his wife's dignity, but Preston pointed out that preventing a pastor from offering appropriate blessings or physically blocking access to mourners went far beyond protecting dignity. It was the behavior of someone desperately trying to hide something. Preston then addressed the medical evidence directly. He had Erasmus look at the anatomical diagrams Dr. Macmillan had used, showing the exact location of the injuries on Clara's neck. In a firm, accusatory voice, Preston asked how Erasmus explained the bilateral contusions consistent with fingers pressing against the trachea. How did he explain the completely crushed cricoid cartilage? How did he explain the vertebral displacement that required specific rotational force? Erasmus tried to maintain his story of an accidental fall, but he was clearly crumbling under the pressure of the relentless cross-examination. It was at this moment that something extraordinary happened. Preston, realizing he had Erasmus completely cornered, asked a seemingly simple question that would completely change the course of the trial. He asked Erasmus if he had loved Clara. Erasmus immediately replied that yes, of course he had loved his wife. Preston then asked how a man who loved his wife could be so calm upon discovering her dead, could spend time arranging her body instead of seeking help, could act so controlled throughout the wake when he should have been devastated by the loss. Something inside Erasmus seemed to snap at that moment. Perhaps it was the accumulated pressure of months of imprisonment, the weight of the lies he had told and retold, or simply the impossibility of maintaining the pretense in the face of such direct questioning. His expression changed. The mask of a grieving and unjustly accused man began to crack, revealing something much darker beneath. With a voice that began quietly but grew in volume and intensity, Erasmus began to speak in a way that shocked everyone present. He didn't confess directly, but what he said was almost as damning. Erasmus began to talk about how Clara had disappointed him, how she wasn't the wife he'd expected, how she questioned his decisions and challenged his authority in ways no woman should. He spoke of how he felt he was losing control over his own home, of how the frustration grew inside him until it became unbearable. His voice was thick with barely contained rage, not remorse or sadness, but anger directed at the victim herself for not being submissive enough. Howard desperately tried to intervene, realizing his client was self-destructing on the dais, but Erasmus completely ignored his lawyer. He continued talking about how women needed to learn their place, about how he had tried to teach Clara the same way he had tried to teach Ali, about how neither of them had understood that a husband had a right to be obeyed in his own home. While he didn't explicitly say, "I killed her," his words painted the picture of a man who believed he was justified in his violence against women who didn't conform to his expectations. The jury was visibly horrified. Some members exchanged incredulous looks, unable to believe they were witnessing a defendant essentially admit his guilt through a diatribe that revealed not remorse, but indignation at having been caught. Preston allowed Erasmus to continue speaking, recognizing that each additional word was another nail in the defense's coffin. Finally, when Erasmus seemed to have run out of energy, Preston simply said he had no further questions and returned to his table, leaving the defendant on the dais, trembling and sweating, apparently stunned by his own words. Howard requested a recess, desperately needing to regroup and try to control the catastrophic damage his client had caused. Judge Thompson granted a 2-hour recess, during which Howard would no doubt try to convince Erasmus that he had destroyed any chance of acquittal with his emotional outburst. But the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom had seen and heard a man who, under pressure, had revealed himself not to be a wrongfully accused widower, but someone with a dangerous mindset who viewed women as property to be controlled and punished when they failed to comply. When the trial resumed after the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed dramatically. What had previously been a case that, despite substantial evidence, still clung to some element of procedural uncertainty, now seemed to have an inevitable outcome. The jury members looked at Erasmus with expressions that ranged from revulsion to morbid fascination, as if they were seeing for the first time the true nature of the man seated at the defense table. Howard appeared visibly shaken, his shoulders hunched under the weight of impending defeat, but professionally committed to seeing the remainder of the trial through to its conclusion. The defense had no more significant witnesses to present. Erasmus's collapse on the stand had rendered any further attempts to characterize him as innocent not only futile, but potentially counterproductive. Howard made a brief statement reiterating that his client deserved a fair trial based on evidence, not emotions or statements made under the extreme pressure of hostile cross-examination, but even he seemed to not fully believe his own words. With few options remaining, Howard announced that the defense had concluded its presentation of evidence. Judge Thompson declared that closing arguments would begin the following morning, giving both the prosecution and defense time to prepare their final words to the jury. It was a long night for everyone involved. Preston worked until the early hours of the morning, refining his closing argument to ensure each crucial point was presented clearly and convincingly. Howard struggled with the impossible task of constructing a closing argument that could somehow mitigate the disaster his client had created, and Erasmus remained in his cell, seemingly listless again, as if his emotional outburst had drained him of all his remaining energy. On the morning of the 9th day of the trial, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity. News of Erasmus's collapse on the dais had spread quickly, and many who had been unable to attend the previous days insisted on being present for the closing arguments. Judge Thompson opened the session with clear instructions on appropriate courtroom behavior, anticipating that emotions might run high during the closing statements. He then gave the floor to Prosecutor Preston for his closing argument. Preston stood directly before the jury, making eye contact with each of the 12 men who would determine Erasmus's fate. He began his speech not with furious accusations or fiery rhetoric, but with a quiet reflection on the responsibility each juror bore. He spoke of how justice in small Appalachian communities depended on the courage of ordinary men willing to confront difficult truths, even when those truths involved crimes committed by neighbors, even within the sacred walls of matrimony. Preston then led the jury through all the evidence presented during the trial, building his narrative step by step. He began with Erasmus's history, the established pattern of violent behavior against women, the ignored complaints, the mysterious death of his first wife. He painted the portrait of a man who viewed women not as equal partners, but as possessions to be controlled. Each document, each previous testimony, was revisited, connected, woven into a tapestry that revealed a serial predator who had finally committed the irreversible crime. The prosecutor then addressed the relationship between Erasmus and Clara, using the witnesses' own words to show how their marriage had been marked from the beginning by signs of danger. He quoted Martha Jane Heaster, describing the fear in her sister's eyes. He recalled Mary Jane Robinson sharing Clara's prophetic last words. He mentioned the neighbors who had heard arguments, the woman who had sold ointments for bruises, all small signs of a home where violence was ever present, waiting to explode into final tragedy. Preston then described the morning of January 23rd in vivid detail. He asked the jury to imagine Clara in that isolated house, perhaps preparing breakfast, or simply beginning another day of her difficult life. He asked them to imagine Erasmus arriving, perhaps already enraged by some perceived offense, his rage building to the point where the control he so valued demanded reassertion in the most brutal way possible. Preston did not describe the act of strangulation in graphic detail, respecting both the guidelines of decorum and Clara's memory, but he made clear through careful language that Erasmus had taken his wife's life with his own hands, feeling her struggle, watching her die, and then coldly staging an accident to conceal his crime. The behavior during the wake was revisited with particular emphasis. Preston argued that these actions were not those of a grieving husband, but of a panicked killer, desperate to keep his secret. Every obsessive gesture Erasmus made that day, every time he prevented anyone from getting too close to the body, every moment he held Clara's head possessively, all of it revealed a sense of guilt and an attempt to obstruct her. An innocent man would have nothing to hide, no reason to act so bizarrely and controllingly. Then Preston addressed the medical evidence, the most devastating part of the entire case. He reminded the jury of Dr. Macmillan's detailed testimony, his clear explanations of how Clara's injuries could not have been caused by an accidental fall. He emphasized that 3 different doctors, independently examining the body, had reached the same unequivocal conclusion. Clara Belle Hensley had been murdered by manual strangulation, followed by deliberate breaking of the neck. There was no ambiguity, no medical uncertainty, just cold, irrefutable facts. Finally, Preston addressed what everyone had witnessed the previous day, Erasmus's breakdown under cross-examination. The prosecutor was careful here, knowing he needed to frame that moment so the jury would understand its significance without feeling emotionally manipulated. He argued that under the pressure of direct questioning, when the lies became untenable, Erasmus's true nature had emerged. His words about controlling women, about teaching obedience, about frustration growing into unbearable, all revealed not only a capacity for violence, but a mindset that saw such violence as justified. Preston concluded his closing argument with a powerful appeal to the jury's conscience. He spoke of Clara as a real person, not just a victim in a court case, but a beloved daughter, a cherished sister, a woman who deserved to live her life to the fullest. He spoke of how her death should not be in vain, of how the jury had the power and responsibility to ensure justice was served. He emphasized that convicting Erasmus would not be an act of revenge, but of protection, ensuring that a dangerous man would not have the opportunity to victimize another woman. With a firm voice and eyes fixed on the jury, Preston declared that the evidence was overwhelming. The guilt was clear, and the verdict should reflect the truth. Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe had murdered his wife, Clara Belle Hensley. The silence that followed Preston's closing argument was thick with emotion. Some women in the audience wept openly, men discreetly wiped their eyes, and even members of the jury seemed visibly affected by the prosecutor's words. Judge Thompson allowed a few moments for emotions to subside before granting Howard the floor for the defense's closing argument. The task before the defense attorney was monumentally difficult, perhaps impossible, but he had a professional obligation to try. Howard began his closing statement by openly acknowledging the difficulty of his position. He admitted that his client had made mistakes, that his past was not spotless, and that his behavior during and after Clara's death had been questionable. But he implored the jury to remember the fundamental principle of American justice, the presumption of innocence and the requirement that guilt be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Howard argued that although the circumstances were suspicious, although the evidence seemed to point to guilt, there was still room for alternative interpretation. He suggested that Erasmus, upon discovering his wife dead under tragic circumstances, had gone into a state of shock that explained his bizarre behavior. Howard argued that grieving people often act irrationally, that there is no instruction manual for how one should react upon finding their spouse dead. As for the emotional outburst during the interrogation, Howard framed it as the result of extreme pressure, of a man being pushed beyond his limits by aggressive questioning, not as a confession or evidence of guilt. But even as he spoke, Howard seemed aware that his words rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. He had given his best effort, fulfilling his ethical obligation to give Erasmus a full defense. But when he finally concluded and returned to his desk, even he seemed relieved that his role in this terrible drama was coming to an end. The fate of Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe was now completely in the hands of 12 men who would have to deliberate on evidence that seemed to point unequivocally to only one possible conclusion. Judge Thompson presented his instructions to the jury with the solemnity appropriate for a case of such gravity. He carefully explained the legal standards that should guide their deliberation, defining what constituted first-degree murder under Virginia law at the time. He emphasized that to convict, the jury needed to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Erasmus had intentionally and premeditatedly taken the life of Clara Belle Hensley. Thompson also instructed them on the possibility of alternative verdicts, including second-degree murder or even acquittal if the jury determined the evidence was insufficient to support a conviction. With these final instructions, the 12 men were led into the deliberation room adjacent to the courtroom. The wait began. In Appalachian homicide cases of that era, deliberations could last days, especially when they involved the potential death penalty. But this jury faced a case that, despite its emotional complexity, presented relatively straightforward evidence. The courtroom remained open, with people coming and going, chatting in small groups about their expectations of the verdict. Mary Jane Robinson sat in her seat, still as a statue, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door through which the jury had disappeared. She had waited months for this moment, and now that it was so close, she seemed almost unable to breathe as she awaited the decision that would determine whether her daughter would receive justice. Just 3 hours after deliberations began, the jurors signaled they had reached a verdict. The speed of the decision surprised some, but many interpreted it as a clear indication of unanimity regarding the defendant's guilt. The courtroom quickly filled again, with people rushing from nearby taverns and shops upon hearing the verdict was imminent. Judge Thompson returned to his elevated seat. Prosecutor Preston and Attorney Howard took their positions, and Erasmus was brought back into the room looking smaller and more frail than at any previous point in the trial. The 12 jurors filed in single file and took their seats. Judge Thompson asked if they had reached a verdict. The jury foreman, a respected farmer named William Harrison, stood holding a piece of paper. In a firm voice that echoed through the quiet room, He declared that yes, the jury had reached a unanimous decision. The judge then asked the formal question: in the case of the Commonwealth of Virginia against Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, charged with first-degree murder in the death of Clara Belle Hensley, what is the jury's verdict? William Harrison looked directly at Erasmus before answering: guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment before its full weight hit everyone present. Guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in reaction. Some people shouted in triumph, others wept in relief, and there was even scattered applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel demanding order. Mary Jane Robinson covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with deep sobs that came from a place beyond words. Her daughter had received justice. The system had worked, despite all its imperfections and prejudices. Erasmus showed no visible reaction to the verdict. He remained seated, staring straight ahead, as if those words were spoken about someone else in another trial. Perhaps he had always known, deep down, that this would be the inevitable outcome. Perhaps all his apathy of the past few months was the result of internally accepting a truth he would never admit publicly. Or perhaps there was simply something broken within him, some fundamental inability to process the consequences of his own actions. Judge Thompson scheduled the sentencing phase for 2 weeks later, allowing time for appropriate reports to be prepared. Under Virginia law, first-degree murder qualified for the death penalty by hanging, and it was virtually certain that this would be the sentence imposed. As Erasmus was led back to his cell, handcuffed and escorted by guards, many in the courtroom remained processing what they had witnessed. This trial had been more than just a criminal case. It had become a moment of collective reflection on domestic violence, on women's rights, on how society failed to protect those who suffered behind closed doors. In the following days, newspapers across Virginia published extensive coverage of the trial and verdict. Clara Belle Hensley's case became a topic of discussion in homes, churches, and public squares. Many women saw it as validation of their own experiences, an acknowledgement that the violence they suffered was neither normal nor acceptable. Some men reacted defensively, uncomfortable with the scrutiny of power dynamics in marital relationships. But others, particularly those who had followed the trial closely, began to question attitudes they had always taken for granted, wondering if they were perpetuating the same destructive patterns that had led to Clara's death. The sentencing phase proceeded as scheduled. Judge Thompson heard brief arguments from both sides, though the outcome was already largely determined by the severity of the crime and the lack of any mitigating circumstances. Howard made a final plea for leniency, suggesting life imprisonment instead of execution, but his words lacked conviction. Preston argued that the death penalty was appropriate not only as a punishment, but as a statement from society that spousal murder would not be tolerated. The judge agreed, sentencing Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue to death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. The execution was scheduled for early August 1889. During the weeks leading up to that date, Erasmus received visits from a local pastor who tried to help him come to terms with his fate and his sins. Records suggest that Erasmus finally expressed something resembling remorse in his final days, though it's impossible to know whether it was genuine or simply the despair of a man confronting his own imminent mortality. He never formally confessed, maintaining to the end a version of the story that he was more a victim of circumstance than a conscious perpetrator of murder. On the morning of the execution, a small crowd gathered outside the Lewisburg jail. Public executions were events that attracted morbid curiosity, but they also served as a somber reminder of the consequences of crime. Erasmus was led to the temporary gallows, built especially for the occasion. He climbed the wooden steps with hesitant steps, his pale skin contrasting with the dark clothes he wore. When offered the opportunity for final words, he declined with a simple shake of his head. The executioner positioned the hood over his face and adjusted the rope around his neck. Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue paid the ultimate price for taking the life of Clara Belle Hensley. Mary Jane Robinson did not witness the execution. She had returned to her mountain home after the trial, carrying with her a mixture of relief and sadness that would never completely leave her. Justice had been served, but no verdict could bring her daughter back. No sentence could fill the void left by the loss of Clara. Mary Jane would live another 17 years after those terrible events, and in that time, she would become a quiet but determined advocate for women in domestic violence situations, offering shelter and counsel when possible, using her own experience as testimony to what could happen when danger signs were ignored. The case of Clara Belle Hensley left a deep mark on the Appalachian region of Virginia. It became a story told and retold, a cautionary tale about the dangers hidden behind facades of normalcy. The small property where Clara died remained empty for years, no one wanting to live in the place marked by such tragedy. Eventually, the structure deteriorated and was consumed by the ever-growing vegetation of the mountains, until only those who knew the story could pinpoint its exact location. The Livesey Mill Methodist Cemetery still exists, and within it, Clara's modest headstone marks the spot where her body finally found rest after all the turmoil it endured. Looking back across the decades and centuries that separate us from that terrible winter of 1889, the case of Clara Belle Hensley resonates with disturbing relevance. The domestic violence that took her life was not an anomaly from a distant era, but a manifestation of patterns that persist to this day. Erasmus's attempts to control and then silence his wife reflect dynamics that countless women still face. Mary Jane Robinson's determination to seek justice, challenging social norms that discouraged women from questioning authority, anticipates modern movements that demand that victims' voices be heard and taken seriously. Clara's story reminds us that behind every statistic about domestic violence lies a real person, someone with dreams and fears, someone who deserved to live their life to the fullest. She reminds us of the importance of paying attention to the danger signs, of offering support to those suffering, of not accepting violence as an inevitable part of relationships. And perhaps most importantly, she reminds us that justice, though often slow and imperfect, is still possible when courageous people refuse to accept convenient lies in place of difficult truths. In the mountains of Virginia, where mists still shroud the valleys on chilly mornings and the wind whispers through ancient forests, some say the memory of Clara Belle Hensley lingers, not as a ghost haunting the site of her death, but as a more subtle presence, a reminder that every life has value, every story deserves to be told, and every injustice cries out for resolution. May her story, told more than a century later, continue to inspire vigilance against violence and courage to seek justice, no matter how difficult the path. If you were impacted by this dark story from the Virginia Appalachians, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this case that forever marked the region. Subscribe to the channel to follow more disturbing accounts of historical mysteries that reveal the darkest secrets of human nature. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any investigations, and leave a like if you enjoy content that delves deep into cases that time has tried to erase, but that deserve to be remembered.